Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking more about the women's soccer team, the World Cup team, and how instead of reporting on the game and reporting on the results and the competition between the different teams that are playing for the title, the World Cup title, instead the news reports and the media are all focusing on salary income inequality. That's the crisis. And I wanted to point that out because this is just another example of what happens in a world that's driven by conflict and division and anger and all kinds of these type of emotions instead of the actual events that are taking place. And this ties into the Marxist socialist worldview, because if you read through the writings of Karl Marx, you're going to find out that the way he says that you have to bring about social change is you have to pit one group against the other. You have to find division in society. You have to find where there is animosity between one party and another party. And when you find that animosity, you've got to throw fire on it. You've got to throw fuel on it and light a fire. And by doing that, by producing conflict in society, you can get social change. And that's right out of Karl Marx's playbook of communism. And you can go right back into Karl Marx's writings, Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. You can go back in there. You can read about the class division that he emphasizes, pitting the managers versus the workers, and pitting the lower class against the upper class. And you can see all of these things right there in the seminal writings of Karl Marx. You can see how he planned on uniting the workers of the world, and they were all united against the so-called bourgeoisie, which was essentially the business owners and the people who hire workers and the people who are the ones that pay workers to work and produce a product. Karl Marx had as a plan, and that plan involves conflict, division, emphasizing disgruntled, angry animosity among workers toward management, fostering division in society wherever it can be fostered. And that was the method of Karl Marx. It's all in his writings, very simple to read. Now, if you go fast forward and you look at the tactics that are being used today, if you look at what's being used in the news media, for example, the liberal leftist news media, you will see that this same tactic is being used, and it's being used everywhere. So it's not just between workers and management, it's not just between lower class and upper class, it's everywhere. You take that whole basic idea of promoting disgruntlement, and you have that whole idea of promoting division and conflict in society, and then the theory is out of that conflict will come a better society, but you have to produce that revolution first of all, or else it won't take place. And so the news media, they're using this whole technique, whether they know it's from Karl Marx or not, they're using this technique to try to bring about social change. And we see one more example of this in the world of women's soccer. Women's soccer is popular, but it's not nearly as popular as men's soccer. No question. That's just the reality of it. Why is that? Why is it that women's soccer is not as popular as men's soccer? Probably because that the men play on a higher level than the women. The men play, they're faster, they're stronger, they're more competitive, there's more action, and they just play the game of soccer better than the women. There's no question about that. If you were to take the worst men's professional team and put that worst men's professional team against the best women's professional team, you would find that every time the worst men's team beats the best women's team in soccer. And it's that way in almost every sport. Every professional sport where there have men and women's sports in the professional sporting area, you will find that the worst men's team in the professional sports are better and can beat the best women's team in that specific sport. Now, why is that? It's just a matter of biology. Men are more athletic than women. Men are stronger, muscular-wise than women. They have a better physical framework for running, jumping, and doing physical activity. It's just a fact. It's a biological fact, and there's nothing that can change that. Now, when you translate that into, for example, an area like soccer, soccer will be played at a higher level when men are playing against each other than when women are playing against each other. That doesn't mean that there isn't a market for women's soccer. That doesn't mean that it's not interesting to watch women's soccer. It just simply means that when you're watching women's soccer, you're not seeing soccer played at its most competitive and highest level. You're getting a lower level of soccer. It's not anyone's fault. It's not men's fault. It's not women's fault. It's not the league's fault. It's not the system's fault. It's not that there are administrators that are not administrating correctly, or leaders that are not leading correctly, coaches that are not coaching correctly, players that are not playing correctly. It's not anyone to blame for that. It's just simply a reality. When you have a soccer match and women are playing against women, that soccer game is going to be not as interesting as when men normally speaking, it's not going to be as interesting as when you see a top men's teams playing in competition against each other. And that is just a reality. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not certain soccer matches where it's more interesting to watch a certain women's team against another women's team rather than a men's team against a men's team. There are situations where it's more interesting to watch the women, but overall economically, people are willing to pay more money for tickets to men's game than they are to women's game. And more people are interested in paying those higher prices to see the men play, and less people are willing to pay higher prices for the women's team. So what happens is the ticket price has to be lowered for the women's team, and they're not going to draw as many people as the men's team's competition. That's just an economic reality. Now, what makes it so silly for the news media to try to promote this idea of income equality and parity of salaries for the men and the women is that they're going against just the simple economics of the situation. In other words, they're trying to say it shouldn't be the case that men are paid more than women to play soccer. It shouldn't be the case. It doesn't seem to be fair, but in reality, it actually is the case that people will pay more and they'll come in greater numbers to watch the men. Now, that means that overall there will be more money generated by men's soccer than women's soccer. A lot more money. Billions and billions of dollars more than the women generate, okay? So out of that billion and billions and billions of dollars that the men's soccer generates over the globe, the men, therefore, are going to get more money, even if they take a smaller percentage of the total pie generated by the league. And that is exactly the case. Men overall make more money in the men's soccer league, even though they're taking a smaller percentage than the women take out of their overall earnings. So the women are taking a bigger slice out of the total earnings that they make, and they're still not making as much as the men. And it's simply a matter of economics. So it's not a matter of injustice, it's not a matter of discrimination, it's not a matter of gender discrimination and all these other things. It's just a matter of economics. So there really shouldn't be any controversy here, but the news media can't let that go. They don't want to accept the economic reality of the situation. It's the same way when you're talking about income inequality, gender inequality in the marketplace, in the workforce. The radical left, the news media, and the socialists are all trying to say that there is a radical wage gap differential between men and women in the marketplace, and that's due to sexism, or that's due to gender discrimination, and that's due to people holding false views in their minds about men and women. And they're saying it's not fair, it's not right, and it shouldn't happen, and we have to pass laws, we have to do policy changes to get that wage gap, the gender wage gap, brought together. And again, that's ignoring the economic realities of the situation. The reality is that if you look at the fields that women tend to want to work in and actually do go and work in, you're going to find that a lot of those fields are lower paying jobs. And they also like the flexibility of not having to work the longer hours in those fields, and they can go back home and they can also be with their children and family more. Whereas men who are trying to earn more money and they're trying to climb the ladder of success are willing to work longer hours, and they're willing to go into fields that women would not typically go into. So you're going to have then various factors for the reason why men and women and their wages are different, and you're going to have different economic reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's because of gender discrimination. It doesn't mean that there has to be a complete overhaul of the economic system in order for women to earn exactly the same amount as men. Because when you're doing that, you're imposing something on society like socialism, like communism wants to do. But see, the media, because of their socialist bent, their radical leftist bent, their bias in that direction, they're going to continue to report the disgruntlement, the anger, and the rage, or they're going to create that if they have to try to get people to change. And we see that here with the Women's Soccer League. The Women's Soccer League, they're playing against the best women in the world. Great. That's a great news story. They're battling it out. Some teams are stronger, some teams are weaker. The best two teams will eventually get to the finals, and the best teams will face each other, and the best team will win. And that's news in and of itself, and that's what should be reported. But unfortunately, like I recapped earlier, that's not the big news story. The big news story is that the captain of the U.S. women's team, she is leading a crusade. And it's not just to win the games, it's also to get income equity with the men, so to speak. And they show these players, these women players, many of whom are lesbians. The captain, I'm not saying that she is, and she isn't, but the coach of the team is a lesbian. And then there are a number of lesbians on the team. Some of the key players are lesbian. So they're in the part of this radical left, and they're right in line with this income inequality fight. And so now they're disgruntled, they're angry at what they call the patriarchy, and they're buying right into the feminist ideology. We see this all over society. And as Christians, we have to step back and we have to say, wait a minute. We are not, this is not our agenda. This whole radical leftist socialist agenda, this is not the agenda that comes from the Bible. God made men and women differently because He made them to do different things. And if you're going to spend your entire life, your entire existence, trying to fight against God's created order, if you're going to try to fight against the fact that men and women are different, if you're thinking in your head, it shouldn't be that way, it must not be that way, and I'm going to dedicate my life to fighting against any kind of inequality between men and women, any kind of inequality of outcome. Opportunity, that's different, that's fine. We should all have the same opportunity to use our gifts and our talents and our skills to the best of our ability, to the glory of God. But when you take it a step further and go, no, we demand not only equality of opportunity, but we demand equality of output, equality of outcome. And that's what these women's soccer players are saying. They're saying, we not only want an opportunity to play soccer just like the men, we want not only the opportunity to play in the best league and get the best women together for soccer, we want a guarantee that our salaries, the income output, the income outcome will be the same as the men. That's the only justice that we will accept. Well, that is a socialist agenda. That is a Marxist, socialist, radical leftist agenda. And unfortunately, women's soccer has been locked into that socialist leftist agenda now for many, many years. We've already seen this in their buying into the LGBTQ community's campaign to try to normalize all kinds of sexual perversion in sports. And the women's soccer celebrates, recognizes, and participates in the so-called Gay Pride Month of June. They were forcing all of the women's soccer players to wear the LGBT rainbow uniform to show their support for the LGBT Pride Month. And this, again, is the radical leftist attempt to try to change society. And you get that same agenda with all of the different causes. But now this one, this income inequality cause, is now being promoted by the media. And so when you tune into women's soccer, the World Cup tournament, you're probably going to get the scores of the games, but you're not going to just get the scores of the games. You're going to also hear all of this other backstory that's taking place, this other narrative that's being spun, and how the women are not only winning games, but they're also demanding higher wages, and they're angry and they're mad. I noticed on the cover of Time magazine, the captain of the women's soccer team, I believe her name is Lisa Morgan. She's poised on the cover of Time magazine, and she has a frown on her face, and she's angry, and you can tell that she's mad at someone. And if you read into the article, she's mad at the organizers of soccer who are setting the wages, and they're not paying the women players enough, because when you look at the men's salaries, they're way up here, and the women's salaries are only down here, and that's not fair, because the women are saying, well, we're playing the same amount of games, and we're just as good as the men in our league, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to build this case for income parity. And again, totally ignoring the economics of the situation, totally ignoring the total money revenue generated by men's soccer and the revenue generated by women's soccer, and they're trying to put aside all of those income differences. And it's when you look at the math, and if you look at the figures, and you look at the data, you look at the men's earnings and their level of scale, economic scale, and then you look at the women's earnings and look at the women's economic level of scale, you're going to say, well, of course, the women will be paid less because their whole league generates less. And if you have all of the other overhead expenses paid out of that, then you have the salaries that have to be paid. And proportionally, like I said before, percentage-wise, the women are actually getting a bigger chunk of the overall income for the women's league. And the men are actually getting a smaller percentage of the overall income level of the league, of the men's league. But if you look at this on an emotional level, and if you look at this from a artificial socialist, Marxist, radical leftist level, it doesn't matter, because economics don't matter, and proportion and scale doesn't matter at all. Only thing that matters is getting what you want and getting a so-called artificial equalization of salaries. And we've been seeing this happening all over our society, in the Western nations especially, this socialist Marxist idea that you have to equalize the outcome of everything in order for there to be justice in society. It's not enough just to equalize the opportunities. That's what we all should be striving for. Equal opportunity, not equal outcome, because everyone's different. Everyone has different skills. Everyone has different visions and plans and desires for what they want to do. The women in the workforce in the United States, for example, maybe they want to have more flexibility. They want to be able to take time off with their children. If they're young mothers, they want to be able to have flexible schedules so that they can go home and take care of their children, attend to the needs of their family, and so on and so forth. So they would then rather have a job where it's more flexible and a lower pay than have a high demand job that is not flexible but has greater pay. Whereas the men who are not as tied to the children, not tied to the family as much, the family is not dependent on them to be emotionally present and so forth as much, they would tend to have a higher wage but less flexible schedule. And there are all these other factors. So again, equality of outcome is not practical. It makes no sense. And we saw what happened in these socialist Marxist countries when they try to do that. The Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union. We saw the economic system collapse there. We saw what happened in Greece, where you have all of these idealistic economic agendas put out there and the whole economy collapses. And here in the United States now, we are pressured into thinking along the lines of these failed economies. So it's not that we can learn from these failed economies. We actually have to, it seems like the left wants us to actually not just learn from them, but actually experience the failure that they went through. And that's what will happen. But it's sad to see everything in our society politicized like we're seeing today. And a big reason for that, a big explanation for that, is that the news media will not simply report news. They have to do the editorializing. They have to do the agitation. They have to do the community organizing and the activist work as well. A lot of the journalists in the mainstream media are actually activists. They actually are agitators. They're actually political operatives who have gone into journalism not to report the news, but to actually bring about social change. And so when they come up to a story like the World Cup soccer, the women's team, they don't want to just report the scores. They don't want to just tell about the different activities that are happening on the field. They don't want to talk about the strategies. They don't want to talk about the game itself, because they see that as boring in and of itself. What they really want to do is change society. They want to change the world. They're activists. They're agitators. They're usually radical leftists. And so what they're going to do then is not just report the score, not just tell what happened on the game, not just tell you who won the game. They're going to tell you that the women are angry and disgruntled and enraged because they're not getting paid as much as the men, and this has to be corrected, and they're on a crusade for all women. And so then they interview women on the team. They ask them loaded questions and leading questions like, how do you feel that you're not being paid as much as the men in the other soccer league, the men's soccer league? And then when, of course, the women say, well, I'm not really happy about that. I want to be paid equal pay for equal work. Okay, and then the news article just uses those quote as more fuel for the fire to try to get people angry and upset and agitated in society in there. And then they build on this entire momentum, and they use events like the World Cup soccer as excuses to do activism. And that's what we see. So as Christians, we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that we are being manipulated by the news media. We have to be aware that when news is fed our way, it's not just news. It's activist news. It's agitating. It's doing the work of the community organizing, activistic work, trying to get America divided. And unfortunately, it's working. So we have to be aware of that and not buy into that, and certainly not let ourselves be led by that. Well, I hope that's been a helpful analysis, and we'll see you back next week on another edition. God bless.